Welcome to the State Library's first virtual Lunch and Learn presentation, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ellen Schenk, and I'm a librarian with the State Library. So the State Library is open virtually. We're able to answer your online questions. We'll provide you access to peer-reviewed journals, newspapers, or ebooks with your State Library card. So if you don't have one already, please visit statelibrary.pa.gov to sign up. Today, we're honored to welcome William Burton and Barry Loveland to discuss their new book out in central Pennsylvania, The History of an LGBTQ Community. Outside of major metropolitan areas, the fight for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights have had its own unique and rich history, one that is quite different from the national narrative set in New York and California. Out in central Pennsylvania highlights one facet of this lesser known but equally important story, immersing readers in the LGBTQ community building and social networking that has taken place in small cities and towns in the heart of Pennsylvania from the 1960s to the present day. A little bit about our authors. William Burton is the author of Out in Central Pennsylvania and lives in Provincetown, Massachusetts. He has a master's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts, and his thesis was in LGBT history. Barry Loveland is a co-founder and chair of the LGBT Center of Central PA History Project, and is retired after a 32-year career with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Barry assisted the author in creating and researching material for the book's content and editing the manuscript. We are going to talk about the book today, listen to some readings by the authors, and we'll have a question and answer period following their talk. Please ask questions in the chat, and our moderator, Nicole, and I will share these with the authors. So welcome, Bill and Barry. To begin our conversation today, may I ask, how did the book come about?
Thank you. Well, first of all, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. It's exciting to be here. The book came about, I moved to Philadelphia in 2015, and I had just actually finished my master's degree at University of Massachusetts at Boston, and I really wanted to use it in some way and keep exploring gay history. And so I looked around at what organizations that I could do that with, and I discovered the LGBT History Project in Harrisburg. And so I emailed Barry and asked to meet with him, and to volunteer for the organization. And when you say volunteer, it's like, I don't want a job, I just want to volunteer. So I met with Barry in Harrisburg and found out what they were doing. They were taking oral histories of gay people, LGBT people around in central Pennsylvania. And Barry gave me at that time like 50 of these oral histories to read, to kind of see what I was getting into, to actually do some interviewing myself. And when I read these oral histories, quite frankly, I was just blown away. I was just stunned at the stories that they were telling. There were stories of harassment, discrimination, plus some of the stories about how some of these organizations came about. And I told Barry, I said, these stories would make a terrific book. But I said, but the problem is, would be trying to find a publisher. That's always a problem. You got a great book idea, you got to find a publisher. Well, as serendipity would happen, like a week later, Penn State, Barry had written an article about what the project was about, and Penn State, one of the editors at Penn State had seen this article, and they contacted Barry. And they said, we saw what you're doing. We think what you're doing could possibly be good material for a book. Would anybody on your staff be willing to work with you, or anybody on your staff be willing to work with us? Well, hello, me. And so it just kind of fell into our laps that we had a publisher right there willing to work with us. And so I began working with the editor at Penn State to develop the book proposal. And that took about 9 months. To develop a proposal that Penn State would agree to, and they gave us a contract. And so then spent the next 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, writing the book. And so with Barry's guidance, once we're going to do it by decades, from the 60s on to the present. So, it's with Barry's help, because I wasn't from the area, to determine, who we should talk about, who are the most important people, what organizations, who were the movers and shakers. And that's kind of how we formatted the book. And, it was really important, when going through this, that we realized that, there's been books written about, rural areas and non-urban areas, because the books have been written about gay, LGBT history, basically been centered about large urban areas, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and you don't really think about these small rural areas. Mm-hmm. And the books have been written about those rural areas, basically been about race, class, gender, or their coming out stories. None of them really talk about how a community forms. And no book like that has ever been written. And I think that's what sets this book apart, and what makes it important for gay history is the development of a community within a small, non-urban area. So we stayed in that focus, and we focused mainly, because we couldn't make it a 1,000-page book, we stayed focused mainly on the areas of Harrisburg, Lancaster, York, and we ventured outside a little bit, like State College, Williamsport, some of those towns, wherever the people were from, that those towns got incorporated. Like I said, we started in the early 60s, where we started out talking about the coming out process and what was gay life back then, back in the 60s. We talked about coming out, the bars, and some of the police raids that occurred in Harrisburg during that time, kind of the pre-Stonewall harassment that occurred even in Harrisburg at that time in the 60s. There was harassment that occurred with the police raids. There was an interesting story about one of the residents of Harrisburg, Richard Schlegel. Barry, you want to tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Richard?
Sure. Richard Schlegel was born in Barrysburg, Pennsylvania, and he was basically Central Pennsylvania's first gay activist. He went to Penn State University, graduated from there, and then went on to Washington, D.C., got a master's degree at American University. And he went to work immediately for the federal government. And he was there at the time that Senator Joe McCarthy was doing his thing with trying to root out the communists from the government, but also homosexuals as well. And you probably heard of the Red Scare. Well, the Lavender Scare was also going on with rooting out homosexuals. So he lost his job there, was fired, tried to get reinstated, filed a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, but lost. So he was coming back home. His parents were living in Lewisburg at the time, and he decided to drop off his resume at the state of Pennsylvania, thinking, well, maybe he could get a job working for the state. So he ended up being successful in being interviewed and getting a job as the head of the finance at what now is PennDOT, what was then Department of Highways. So he had a very high-profile job working for Department of Highways, in charge of all the finances of the department. And as luck would have it, he decided to get involved in a new gay organization that was in place in Philadelphia at the time, in the Janus Society. And he decided that the people from the Janus Society wanted him to open a branch office, let's say, in Harrisburg. So he decided to do that. He started a branch of the organization in Harrisburg, and he opened up a post office box, and he started getting mail from the organization and so forth. Well, his name appeared in the newsletter of the organization as being the contact person for this gay organization, and he ended up having been called to his boss's office one day, and there was a postal inspector, and he was confronted about the fact that he was receiving this gay material in the mail, and so anyway, he ended up losing his job with the state as well. This was at a time when there were no protections for LGBT people in employment. So it was open season on being able to discriminate against gay people for any reason whatsoever. So anyway, the organization unfortunately folded. He moved to Philadelphia, but he was really the first person in central Pennsylvania who made an effort to work for gay civil rights.
Thanks, Barry. And then in the 70s, we kind of moved into, that's when the actual emergence of some social networks started occurring. The first kind of mover and shaker was a man named Jerry Brennan. And the first networks that actually started developing in central Pennsylvania were religious. And Jerry founded Dignity Central. And then he also formed the Gay and Lesbian Switchboard of Harrisburg. And then also the Metropolitan Community Church, that developed also. And we tell those stories there. I found it kind of interesting that the first non-bar organizations that developed were religious. Then we also chronicle the development of the thing called Lavender Letter. During that time period, there was only like one or very few lesbian bars for women. And this one woman decided that she wanted to develop an outlet for women where women could also meet and socialize outside of the bar environment. And so she developed this letter, and women had to sign up for this newsletter. It was all handled very, very discreetly, how the letter was mailed and how women got on, were vetted to get onto this mailing list. And the woman's name was Lorraine Kajuana. And so they would actually develop events like potluck suppers, going bowling, going to the theater or whatever. But women would get this mailing list and they would say, potluck dinner at so-and-so's house, call this number. And so at the height of this, of their mailing list, this is obviously way before the internet, they had like over 500 women on this mailing list where women could meet and socialize and meet other women. We also chronicle the first newspaper, the gay area newspaper out of Lancaster, and the founder of that, David Lees, that actually brought the community there news that was happening around the nation into central Pennsylvania. We started a profile section of certain individuals and their stories that were kind of appropriate to that time period. That first profile section in that chapter was on Joe Burns, who was an activist. He formed the Lehigh Ho activist organizations. And like many of these early activist organizations, they were trying to spread, this is kind of like right around the Stonewall time period, but fighting for their civil rights and stuff like that. But they also had a very big social component that led to networking for the early gay and lesbian community. This one on Joe really talks about when he went to the first gay pride march in New York right after the Stonewall riots, the very first one. It's really kind of an interesting story. Then we kind of move into the spread of activism and the founding of the homophiles of Penn State. It was known as HOTS. And that was a really unique story. and also what happened to one of its members, Joanne Canfora, who was a student, was getting his teaching certificate, and his difficulty in getting that. He finally got a job teaching in Maryland, but when it came out that that his teaching license was finally approved by Penn State, the headlines wrote, homosexual teacher gets license. Well, the news broke and he lost his job in Maryland. So he sued, and we go through that whole thing of his battle trying to get reinstated as a teacher. And he was profiled on 60 Minutes, and it's a really unique story of what happened to Joe, just from his affiliation with HOTS and the battle for HOTS, and actually its reinstatement too on the Penn State campus. We have another profile there also of people that were fighting against their fights against, like Dan Manville and when he was in the homophiles of Williamsport, and when they protested against Anita Bryant, remember her? The big, when she appeared at the Bloomsburg Festival up in Williamsport, and how his house was destroyed by people after he spoke in protest of Anita Bryant. Then we move into a really interesting chapter which covers what Milton Schaff, the former governor of Pennsylvania in 1975, when he signed an executive order, which was groundbreaking, the first executive order that provided anti-discrimination in state government done by the governor here in Pennsylvania. Barry, you want to talk a little bit about that, what Milton did?
Yeah, sure. Well, just to set up this reading, let me say that Mark Siegel and Harry Langhorne of Philadelphia formed a small activist group called the Gay Raiders. And they used a new form of activism called a ZAP, which was a quick surprise protest action. And they famously interrupted the CBS Nightly News with Walter Cronkite live on the air with a ZAP protest. They got a lot of notoriety for that. And they wrote to Governor Schaff requesting that he meet with them and discuss supporting gay rights. And to their surprise, he answered the letter, agreed to meet with them in Norristown. He was stopping there on a statewide tour. So they organized a meeting. This was the first time that a sitting governor, or probably sitting politician of any stature, met with openly gay activists. So I'll do a little reading from the book. The next day, when Siegel and Langhorne walked into the room, the governor immediately walked over to Siegel with his hand extended and said, smiling, "I've seen you on TV." When Siegel did not seem to understand, the governor added, "Cronkite seemed to be surprised to meet you, but I'm not." Siegel was completely disarmed and felt quickly comfortable with Schaff. They talked for a while, and the governor, rather than asking what Siegel could do for him, instead asked what he could do to help Siegel's cause. According to Siegel, "I always go for the brass ring. So I said, Governor, gay men and lesbians are discriminated against in almost every part of state government." Schaff immediately responded, "How can we change that?" Siegel replied, "Create a commission to explore these problems and find solutions." Schaff responded, "Let me consider the options and get back to you." So in late 1974, Schaff convened a task force to study the issues of importance to the gay community. On November 21st, 1974, the first meeting was held with the governor's staff and a select group of gay community activists. One of the first requests the gay and lesbian activists made was to ban discrimination in employment based on, or on the basis of sexual orientation. Governor Schaff was powerless to do that on behalf of the entire Commonwealth without state legislature passing legislation. He knew that would be an impossible fight. As governor, however, he did have administrative control over the policies in state government. On April 23rd, 1975, Governor Schaap made history by issuing a landmark executive order. So as the story goes on from there, Governor Schaap issued that order, which was, again, groundbreaking. It was the first time anywhere in the country there had been a statewide level protection for state employees. California would not do it for another 3 years after that. And then Governor Schaap wasn't done there. He also created he formalized the task force that had been meeting for about a year into what was called the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. And that was the first governmental body created anywhere in the country, perhaps anywhere in the world, that dealt with public policy and LGBT issues. So that was an extraordinary time in Pennsylvania history, gay history, to have a governor who made such important initiatives on behalf of the LGBT community.
Thanks, Barry. Both Barry and I really thought it was important that we highlight the Milton Schaap story, because I really feel like Milton Schaap was like one of the truly unsung, unrecognized heroes of the LGBT movement, that he was the first one to pass any sort of anti-discrimination measures in the nation, and nobody knows his name, and he's not recognized for it. Certainly there's been a significant progress in LGBT rights, but he was the first, and he should be recognized, duly recognized for what his groundbreaking role was in LGBT rights. Then we move on to the AIDS crisis. This is the early part of the AIDS crisis in the early 80s, and what happened in central Pennsylvania. At the height by 1992 or whatever, 1991, there was something like 15,000 cases in Pennsylvania of AIDS. In central Pennsylvania, there were 1,800, certainly a significant number. And we chronicle how the community came together, forming, SCAN, the organization SCAN, to help deal with the people that were dealing with the AIDS, dealing with the disease of AIDS. And it truly is a very moving story. And then we highlight and profiles Joy Eufema, who opened a hospice in York. But also there was an interesting story about when, by 1987, the drug AZT came out, the first effective drug in the treatment of AIDS. And there was a $30 million government grant given to states for the distribution of AZT. And of course that was handled, within the Civil Service Commission on how that was going to be distributed. And so we have a story here about John Folby and his desire to become the first AZT director for the state of Pennsylvania. And so I'd like just to read that short section about John's application to become that first director. John Folby, a former visual merchandising director for Pittsburgh's venerable Kaufman's department store, had just moved to Harrisburg. He was distressed over the many friends in Pittsburgh and New York who were coming down with AIDS. I started getting really angry, Folby said. I wanted to know what the government was doing. I came home and said to my partner, who worked for the state government, one night, "What's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania doing about all these people who are dying from GRID?" That was known back then. And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, they're going to start an AZT program." So I said, "How do I get that job? I want that job. I want to do that. I want to be that AZT guy." Folby researched the name of the person to see, Susan Love, and went to the state capitol in Harrisburg, made an appointment, and applied in person for the job. In his first interview, Folby said, "I heard about this AZT program. I want that job. I think it'll be my way of helping the community by being a gay person on the inside in the government agency that's going to give them drugs. Love explained to Folby that it was a civil service commission position, and he would be required to officially apply for it, have his application notarized, and then be called back for another interview. Folby complied with the procedures and was called back 3 weeks later. Susan Love told him that she would really like to hire him, but others had experience in state government as well as seniority, which gave them an edge over him. She also said, "The thing you have going for you is that you are the only person out of all of them that wanted the job for what it is, not because it was a promotion." She went on to explain that the other applicants could file grievances if she were to fill the position with a less qualified candidate. Folby responded, "Fine. If you don't hire me, I'll file a grievance and say you didn't hire me because I'm gay. Really, if you want, I'll be real flamboyant about it. I'll put on a feather boa and some chandelier earrings and paint my nails, and I'll go with you to the Civil Service Commission and file a complaint." Love laughed, but she was impressed with Foley and asked him to give her time to work it out. Love had extensive notes from every single interview with the applicants and took them to the head of the civil service. She argued that out of all the people, Folby was the only one who wanted the job for what it was intended for. Within 3 weeks, John Folby was named the Pennsylvania AZT coordinator. So John had a really important job, the first one to do it, and as it expanded, he made the whole thing really, really work. So that's John's story. Then we move on to the fight for the anti-discrimination in Harrisburg, Lancaster, and York. And those were really, it was interesting to research and read. And basically in all three of those cases, the opponents of the anti-discrimination ordinances back then, their whole argument was basically religious. And when you read and researching all the components argument, it was just really horrible bigotry and some vile comments that were said in the fight for. But all three eventually passed. The one in York was really, really amazing because it was really initiated by the mayor there, William Outhouse, who was actually head of the Council of Mayors for the entire country. And he was not really a big advocate of LGBT rights. But when the mayors were going to have their annual meeting for the mayors, they were going to have it in Colorado. But that time, if you remember that time period, Colorado was having its fight to change its laws that would ban all people from getting the teachers, you couldn't be gay and all that kind of stuff. And he was just appalled by what Colorado was doing. And that in fact, the Council of Mayors withdrew their conference from having it in Colorado. And that whole fight turned the mayor into an advocate for LGBT rights. And he came back inspired. And he's the one that initiated that anti-discrimination ordinance in York. So he like Milton Schaff became a big advocate for LGBT rights. And we chronicle his story and the York fight. But in that fight in Lancaster, one of the people that was heading that fight, one of the citizens, was a woman by the name of Nancy Helm. And she had once owned a beauty salon, but her big desire was to open a bookstore. And she did. She opened a bookstore on the main streets in Lancaster. And I'm going to read part of her story here, what happened to Nancy after the fight in Lancaster and what happened to her bookstore. She was being harassed because of her fight in Lancaster, and she was kind of well known. But the harassment soon came to a head in the early morning of June 24th when Nancy received a telephone call at 1 in the morning. The police called and told her that an explosive device had blown out the window of her bookstore. When Nancy arrived, there was the smell of gunpowder everywhere in the store. The front window had been blown out, but the explosion otherwise caused little damage. A quarter stick of dynamite wrapped in cardboard was used in the blast, but no fingerprints were found. The police had no leads or motive, according to an official department incident report. Nancy was convinced it was a combination of gay bashing and the result of the recent controversy over Lancaster city government's decision to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation and marital status. As far as the police were concerned, Captain Joseph Greasy announced, "At this point, we know of no motive." So Nancy moved on, cleaned up her store, replaced the glass, and reopened. The police never reinvestigated the bombing. During the following 3 months, threats and harassment intensified. Soon Nancy found that she was being followed by various people when she was driving her car. She went to the police, gave them a description of one of the cars following her. Without a license plate to identify the vehicle, the police would do nothing. There was a threat of another bombing when someone drove by and yelled, "We will throw the next bomb." Tension was building for Nancy. Everywhere she went, she was recognized. She was frightened and angry. She was becoming a target of hatred. Then in August, the second bomb exploded. This time, the bomber used 4 sticks of dynamite, taped the explosives together, and placed the bomb behind the brass rail of the antique door of the store. The force was so strong that it destroyed a chunk of the brick wall that was 20 feet back in the store. It did a lot of damage, Nancy recounts. I had an old candy case from way back when that I had a lot of my display in, and the glass shard scratched the entire front of it. It was like a sunburst. My gay flag was burned up. This time, a witness who lived a block from the bookstore saw 2 men run from the front of the bookstore just as the explosion went off. It was 2 white males, the witness reported. I couldn't really get a good description. Captain Greasy was again on the scene, confirming to the press that it was an explosive device, and that the police were continuing to investigate this in the first bombing. My reaction to this is this time I don't want to see this buried, Nancy said. I want the police to respond to this. I want this out. The following morning, Nancy stood outside the store with several friends and vowed to keep the bookshop open. I'm going to fight until every gay and lesbian person has what they deserve in this town, she said. Homophobia is curable, read a sign placed over the broken door window. Nancy reopened within a month and was back in business. She kept following up with the police and their investigation, but felt like she was getting the runaround. I felt like when I did inquire, I was just put off. If it would have been anybody else's business, they would have had that same attitude. They didn't look at the closet, that was the name of the bookstore, as a legitimate bookstore. And that was the problem. It was just a gay bookstore. A detective was assigned to the case by the police, but they never had any answers. From August until January, Nancy continued receiving many hate calls and drive-by threats with chants. We're going to blow you up your store again. Even after a successful Christmas season, Nancy received another threat in January and began to consider permanently closing the store. Once in the supermarket, a male shopper stopped her and said that he wanted to kick her ass. Walking down the street, she was met with taunts of, "There's that fucking dyke." This all began to weigh heavily on Nancy. This started Nancy thinking. She had a great Christmas season in the bookstore. The threats started coming again, and she wondered, what am I going to have to deal with this year? Who's going to get hurt this year? What's going to happen? The police are not getting any resolution on finding the bombers. It just felt like something was coming at me at all turns. I just kept thinking, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Under all the pressure, stress, harassment, and fear, Nancy just finally decided to close the bookstore nearly a year to the day after she opened it. So I interviewed Nancy, and even retelling the story 30 years later, she had tears in her eyes. So it's still a very painful memory. So then we move on to the gay pride, the history of gay pride in central Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, the first gay pride, even though in New York, the first gay pride was a year after Stonewall, it didn't occur in central Pennsylvania until like 15 years after the fact. And the first one was called the Open Air Festival. They've since changed, but we chronicle what happened through the Gay Pride in Harrisburg and then Lancaster and York over the course of 1985, I think 83, until current period. And then we move into the 21st century and we cover three major stories. Again, at Penn State, when the basketball player Jen Harris sued the basketball coach Renee Portland for sexual harassment and racial discrimination. The formation of Trans Central PA, the organization, and their Keystone Conference, and then the formation of the LGBT Center in Central Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg. So we try to cover it all. We've got some great profile stories in there, some inspiring ones, and some ones like Nancy Helms that kind of tear your heart apart. But that kind of sums up the book. And I was inspired by all the stories. As I told Barry, I realized that I'd been living in a bubble my entire life because I always went to a safe haven and didn't have to worry about these things. And felt like these stories had to be told. And I think we're real proud of the book. Anything else you want to add, Barry?
No, I think you did a good summary. I think one of the things that I'll mention is that the LGBT History Project, which kind of formed the basis for a lot of the material that we used in researching the book, has been going on since 2012 as a project with the LGBT Center in Harrisburg. And we continue to collect stories even to today. And it's pretty amazing to me, just the breadth and depth of material that we've been able to collect. We could probably write another book as a result of the material that we've collected just since the book's been written. So, you know, I think it's been a rewarding experience to find this material, discover this material, meet the people who have lived this history and, you know, suffered a lot of discrimination, paid a heavy price in some cases for their activism, but they are inspiring stories, to be sure.
Can I ask you, either Barry or Bill, what surprised you in researching or writing the book?
Bill, you want to start?
I think, well, the first thing was the Milton Schaaf story. I had no idea about that. And I thought that was a very, very important piece of history that had to be told. And then some of the stories of discrimination we talk about. One of it's in the last chapter. We talk about MJ Doherty's experience. That happened. She was at the World Trade Center at 9/11, and she was delayed getting to her meeting. All her co-workers were there in the one tower that was hit by the airplane. She was delayed. She was on the phone with her partner, and she just got the phone and she was leaving to go to the meeting when the first plane went into the tower. And all her co-workers were obviously killed. And when she finally made it to the ground, she was watching in horror, that whole horror of 9/11. And she describes it, you know, intimately in her oral history. And she saw people jumping from the other tower. She finally makes her way, you know, to Staten Island and finally makes her way back to Pennsylvania. But in the meantime, you know, there was a time period where her partner couldn't get a hold of her. And so her partner was obviously in a panic. Her partner knew, you know, obviously what was going on, and her partner knew that MJ was in New York and the planes were collapsed. Her partner didn't know if MJ was alive or dead. So her partner calls the office in Harrisburg, saying, you know, have you heard from MJ? What's going on? And her boss said, well, who were you? And her partner said, well, I'm MJ's partner. Well, MJ was not out at work. So her partner had inadvertently outed her by just calling to find about her well-being. So when MJ made it back, safe and sound, obviously with post-traumatic stress syndrome after what she did, the horror that she'd seen, her boss obviously was prejudiced against, you know, gays and lesbians. And so when it came time for her review, she was withheld her raise and her bonus. And even though MJ had made all her metrics that was required of her in her job. And so, you know, she went through to sue to get her back pay, her raise and her bonus. And the lawyer said, because she knew it was because her boss, because she was gay. Well, there was no legal protection for that. And so she couldn't use that case, but she could use the fact that, you know, she is a victim of post-traumatic stress syndrome because of what happened at 9/11. And the company, you know, did give her a raise and did give her bonus. And they moved her from the Harrisburg office to the Philadelphia office because of the condition with her boss. And I was so stunned by that story. This was 2001. And I was living in Boston at the time and working for, you know, I was a retail executive for Filene's at the time. That never would have occurred. I mean, I was just shocked. Those kind of things surprised me. Mm-hmm. Sorry to go on so long, but it was just such an incredible story about MJ.
Mm-hmm. The stories in your book are so, you know, they really suck you in. How did you find the stories that you put in there?
Well, some of them, like I said, were part of, like, we were talking about certain organizations like HOPS, and those people just naturally bubbled up. On the profiles, Barry and I worked together and like, who should we talk about? MJ's, when I read hers, I've got to use MJ's stories, or Nancy Helm. And Barry said, you know, talked about the bookstore bombing in Lancaster. It's like some of those people were just, the incidents were so, you know, those people just naturally came to light, like Joe Eufema and the hospice. I mean, what these people did, their stories just had to come out. Or Mary Nankower, who was a president of the National Organization for Women, you had to tell her story. You know, people had to know about what she did. You know, their contributions were so great. You wanted to bring these stories out.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice any major differences or commonalities in the fights to pass anti-discrimination ordinances in Harrisburg or Lancaster or the communities you mentioned?
Barry, what do you think?
Well, the commonalities certainly, as Bill mentioned earlier, were they used a lot of religious, you know, arguments to protest against the passage of the ordinance. And, you know, there was actually, we had a whole stack of letters that were sent to, I believe it was Lancaster's city council that, you know, were just incredibly, you know, persistent in quoting Bible scripture and all this sort of thing to make their arguments. But it was very interesting that there were a few voices within that community of pastors and so forth that wrote letters counter to those arguments and actually were very supportive of the passage. And those were something that were read into testimony in some of the proceedings that I think made an impact on the results of the passage. In fact, in Harrisburg, it was passed, the ordinance was passed unanimously by City Council. It was at that time, the only ordinance in Pennsylvania to have passed unanimously, and they think perhaps throughout the country. So there were similarities, but also differences in the fact that, like in Lancaster, for example, you had a fight between the city and the county. The city passed the ordinance initially, but then the county refused to enforce it because they were the primary administrator of a joint human relations commission that covered both the city and the county there. And so you had a situation where the people of Lancaster wanted to have this protection in place, but the county overruled it. And that led to a whole series of events, including the marching of the KKK in Lancaster to demonstrate their support of the county's decision to basically make the ordinance ineffective. And then it was a big counter demonstration against the KKK at the time as well. So it was, there were interesting aspects to each story.
And it's just been a slow, steady fight. That's what I found amazing, because there's no statewide, even to this day, there's no statewide ruling, which leaves, 64% of the state non-protected. Only 34% of the state municipalities have ordinances to protect gay people. So that's what I found amazing. Most of those are around the suburbs of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but then you do have like Harrisburg, Lancaster, York, Scranton. Some of those towns have, passed these ordinances, but it's still, now with the recent Supreme Court ruling, that does protect, the workplace, but there's public accommodations and all those other things are still not protected. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Great. There are some questions here in the chat from our audience members. Are you both still collecting stories?
Well, yeah, the LGBT Center History Project is still collecting stories. During this situation with COVID-19, it's been a difficult go because we really don't feel we can do in-person oral history recordings right now. So we haven't been doing them for a number of months now, but we are experimenting with Zoom, this technology that may allow us to do some Zoom oral history interviews with people in the future. And so we're hoping to work that out soon. But yeah, we're excited to be able to collect stories. We actually have about 150 people that we have interviewed altogether. And that we hope to continue that for quite some time.
Great. Have you encountered history of discrimination against transgender people or trans and gender non-conforming communities in Central PA?
Well, that's a really interesting point or question, because we have a number of interviews that we have done with transgender people in Central PA. I don't recall any specific discrimination stories that they brought up, but I would say that there are probably a number of them out there that we just haven't discovered yet, because this community is still kind of evolving and growing and making itself more visible. And so as we find people who are willing to share their stories, there's probably a whole area of exploration of LGBT history here to go with the transgender community. Bill, do you recall anything that?
Yeah, I think that I had the honor of interviewing Mark Kiesling She's in the profile section. She runs the national, down in Washington, D.C., the National Center for Transgender Equality down in D.C., and she was a Harrisburg resident. I mean, she spoke about how, you know, the plight of what happens to transgender people and how they're, the suicide rate, the discrimination that they face, but no one has talked personally in their own stories about that happening. But it was more interesting, the enlightenment of their coming out, their realization that they are transgendered, their process of doing the transition and what goes on. It's an enlightening thing that I think all of society needs to understand what a transgender person goes through, and to increase their own understanding. It certainly helped with me talking to Mara and the people that founded the Trans Central organization. Those women's stories were certainly very, very enlightening and increased my understanding of the transgendered community.
I'd also mention too about with Trans Central PA's presence in Central PA. It's an organization that's fairly new, yet they have managed to create an event every year, which is called the Keystone Conference, which is their annual conference. And it has grown into one of the largest conferences of its type anywhere in the country, and really anywhere in the world. They get 700 to 800 people who attend these conferences, and I've been to a few, and they are really fascinating. They have an incredible array of workshops that they do. It's a really educational experience for the transgender community, and they also get together socially in a lot of events, and it really it has a big impact on so many people, because it's really their opportunity to get together and find other people who share their background and their orientation. So it's really an amazing accomplishment that they've been able to do this here in Harrisburg, which is kind of, you know, unusual that we find an event so large right here in Central PA.
There's a great one here. How do the authors feel when they look at Central PA LGBTQ community today? What would you like to see happen as it continues to grow?
I'll let Barry answer that first.
I think certainly we'd love to see more activism and more empowerment of people to come out and get involved with the LGBT Center and all of its programs. There's a wonderful program there called Common Roads, which we talk about the development of that organization in the book. It's the youth organization. You know, we see now with the Black Lives Movement and so many other activism in current day that there are so many young people that are starting to really come out and feel empowered to do this work. And so, you know, I think it's a really great chance for people to get involved now.
I think that, because I don't live there anymore, but I think that everybody needs the chance to question themselves on making a difference and getting involved for, you know, LGBT rights. And when you look at what still, there's a lot to be done. There's certainly a lot that's been accomplished, but there's a lot that's at risk that we could lose. So one thing I've learned about writing this book is that how people can make a difference, and the people that did step out over the course of the last, you know, 60 years, what difference they made just by starting an organization or fighting for the rights. The people that did step out and do something, what each one of us could do if we step out and do something and try to fight for something. And whether it's in, you know, Central Pennsylvania or here in the Cape, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of minds to be changed. That needs to happen.
James asks, how do we harness these histories for activism? These stories have such amazing power, and I'm curious to hear how you think we can use them to empower people.
Well, I think that's, what I was just saying. I think these stories show that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and some of these people aren't well-known household names. And I think just by, looking at some of these stories and retelling some of these stories, we can help reinforce a point we want to make about what we need to accomplish, or what needs to be accomplished. History's there to guide us and show us which way we need to go, and helps prove a point. That's the point of chronicling history.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry and Bill. We're almost to the 1 o'clock mark. Nicole has a slide here for our viewers to find the book. There are some online options, and there's some in-person bookstores you can visit to pick up Barry and Bill's Out in Central PA. There are also a few more questions that are left in the chat here, and I'm sure that Barry and Bill wouldn't mind sticking on for a few minutes if you want to wait for your question to be asked. Otherwise, thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Barry and Bill, for inspiring us with this work that you've created.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, we'll answer if you want to ask us. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so there was one about places here. Okay, this is from Elizabeth. Do you have a list of buildings you think would be significant for their association with these stories?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have developed now a walking tour of significant historic sites, LGBT historic sites in Harrisburg.
Oh, cool.
And that's on our website. If you go to centralpa.lgbtcenter.org/LGBT-history I guess that's right.
Yeah, let's put that in the chat here.
Yeah, so anyway, that is a paper or a downloadable file that you can create a paper guide to the 29, I believe, historic sites in Central PA, or in Harrisburg, rather.
Mm-hmm.
We are looking at maybe expanding and making guides to other cities in Central PA. We also have a project where we've captured the geographical information of events and organizations and people and so forth in a geographic database and a Google map, and that's also on our website.
Great.
There's about 400 or 500 of those.
Okay. Yeah, I put a link to the website in the chat there too.
Great.
Let's see. Okay, are there any historic places that need to be recognized to help tell the story of the LGBT movement? Some PHMC markers have been dedicated already, but what more could be done?
Right, yeah, there are a few markers in Philadelphia, but there's none in Central Pennsylvania, and that's something that we've been working with PHMC to come up with a list of potential markers, locations in Central PA. Also, as I mentioned, the guides, the guide that we have to Harrisburg, we're going to hopefully be able to start expanding those so that we can have at least some recognition of these sites, even though they may not qualify in some ways for a state marker. But there are certainly important sites that people should know about and should know where they are. And we hope that will lead to some, at least, appreciation and recognition for their contribution.
Yeah, I love that idea. That idea of the walking tour is so cool.
We're trying to come up with a phone app version of that too.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, so hopefully that will be available within the next 6 months or so.
Cool. Nicole asked if the beloved psychotherapist from Lewisburg, Carol Blank, is mentioned in your book.
What is the last name?
Carol Blank, she says.
Blank?
Yeah, I haven't heard of her.
No.
No?
I don't think so, no.
Maybe Lewisburg is outside of the range of the central PA.
I think.
Okay, Dan wrote, no, she's not, I know her. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Look at the chat, Nicole.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not.
Auto Bookstore in downtown Williamsport is working on a front window display of the book with a rainbow
Wonderful
around it.
Yeah, yeah. Dan Manival had mentioned that he was trying to work with them to carry the book and so forth. So we're pleased that they're helping promote the book.
Great. We've gone through the questions. If I missed one, somebody speak up. If you have any more questions.
I think we got everything.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank everyone for coming. Yes.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
Take care. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.